I am Brooke Vickers, and this is Cassidy Morgan. And for our project, we chose Black culture to study for like the COVID, because we both have I have some experience with it, and so does Cassidy a little bit. Um, yeah. So Cassidy, do you want to say anything?
Um, I think this was a really interesting topic to choose because of all of the news coverage that it got, and the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic was just, whether or not the treatment was the same, and it's such a large group of the overall population of the United States. And I haven't grown up with a lot of experience around sort of a very diverse community, but coming to college, of course, it's a much more diverse community. So I think it was really interesting to look at. And I always think it's interesting to learn about other cultures and focus on other people's experiences in the world.
I totally agree with that. I definitely have as a waitress, I've had my experience with Black culture, and definitely worked with some people, and it's always been of course, great people to work with.
Mhm.
But I've also come from Kokomo, which is a smaller town in Indiana, but definitely has that Black culture neighborhood. And I also go to Purdue, and there's several organizations to get involved with, and just so many learning experiences through them. For my admissions project, I just went to different websites and definitely some helpful ones that taught me a lot. For my documentary, I watched this documentary called The Black Power Mixtape, and it basically just focused on the environment from the 1967s, 1975. But it just really showed the violence, the Black Panthers, which that was very interesting because also the organization that I interviewed was it was at Purdue, and they did a whole movement during Purdue at that time, and it was just interesting to see the pictures and just learn about the organization and their upbringing and everything they've gone through to where they are now in life. And then I watched several YouTube videos about how African Americans in America really aren't getting as much proper health care as white Americans, which was really sad to hear about and really sad to watch. And also another video I watched was just the awkwardness of passing, of having to constantly pass different people in the hallway, just being Black, I guess, and having to do that. And then I also watched a podcast that was super interesting, and it also discussed how African Americans are not getting proper health care during COVID, and everything they're lacking with income and just everything in general. And so that's what I really did for my air missions project. How about you,
Yeah.
Cassidy?
For my immersion project, I watched the documentary Eyes on the Prize, which also focused on the civil rights movement. It spanned from 1954 to 1985, so it really covered just the entirety of the civil rights movement. The Black Panthers were definitely a topic that it talked about, and it was really interesting. It was really cool to see, and I think almost every single person and all of the historians that worked on it were African Americans from that community. So that was really cool to see, and a lot of them had lived through that. So that was a very interesting perspective, I think, to get. And then I watched several videos just about the healthcare system in general and how it affects African Americans, but specifically the COVID-19, of course, was the topic of a couple different videos that I watched. And then I listened to a very interesting podcast and watched a very interesting film about the African American community. And the movie I watched actually focused specifically on African American women, so I think that was really cool
Mm-hmm.
to see and just learn about some of the history aspects and the social aspects that I don't think about every day.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I watched a movie too. It's called Just Mercy, and it was basically just about an African man who was sentenced to death by an electric chair, even though he had several alibis during the time of the murder. And it was taking place in the South, and he had a family at the time. And it really was just about the injustice of it was always during the civil or the um 1960s-ish. It was around that time period, but just showed like the social injustice and everything that was going on. And it was just really sad. It's interesting to see how those times from like 40, 50 years ago, how they've impacted like today's like Black culture and society, and like how like now we're just really like seeing how it's affected them, especially with COVID and like the lack of income they have to like really help get the proper medical care. And it's very frustrating, I'm sure, for them. And it's like really kind of makes me feel guilty in a way that like I have such great like access to healthcare and like great doctors. Like if something was to happen to me, and I just wish I could like help out in some way too, and just make sure everybody else is getting the proper same healthcare I am.
Yeah,
And
I agree with that.
yeah, for like also for my service learning project, I basically just posted on my social media. It was from the Black Graduate Student Association at Purdue, and basically it was just an hour-long like segment of Dr. Shanna Hardy and Dr. Nix, who were basically just talking about it was specifically for Black Graduate Student Association, but it really could be for anybody about just like wanting to put on like a proper resume and just helping out like Black students in like the community, especially at Purdue, because you can never really watch too many videos or just get too many instructions about how to do a proper resume, because you can do a resume 1,000 different ways. But it was interesting to watch the video and just seeing like how they help people and just like all the information they provided to like really help out with like when upon like a good resume and having to help like get Black people jobs and white people too.
Yeah, my service learning project was kind of a similar vein, but from a bit of a different side. So my interviewee the person that I interviewed for this was the head of the health department for my area. And they have known me for years. So they actually suggested that as part of this project, I make a presentation that they used in the local schools that my mom's also a teacher at. So my presentation really focused on just the importance of wearing masks, social distancing, and hand washing, and all of that sort of just hygiene, and how children should use it in schools, because of course that is a major place where people get coronavirus.
Yeah, that's
and
huge.
Major place that it spreads. So I thought that was very interesting. I had to, of course, find a lot of really good information to use for that presentation, because you don't want to give false information to like little school kids.
Yeah, definitely.
And it got presented at several of the local schools, so I was pretty excited to do that.
Okay, cool. Okay, for our interview questions, the first one we came up with was, can you describe the community that you serve? And I, for my interviewee in general, I interviewed Renee Thomas, who is the president.
Wait, is it recording?
Yes.
It is?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Continue.
And she is the president of the Black cultural community at Purdue. And so for her answer on, can you describe the community that you serve, she defined it as a very broad community, and they pride themselves in not just like Black culture students, but students of all varieties, including like Latinos and Hispanics, and obviously like white people, and just like everybody of like every race, not just the Black community. And her goal is just like reach out to all community members and just really everybody at Purdue and like within the community, like in Lafayette across the bridge, which was like really great and interesting. She was a really great person to interview too in general. She was very sweet, and she felt very comfortable with her, and it was really great to interview her. And for the second question, I asked her what challenges does the community face on a day-to-day basis, and she answered very calmly with racial justice issues, and she wants to create a safe place where everyone can come and be comfortable in an environment, which was a really good answer. And for my third question, I said, what are some of the reasons that your clientele seek your services? And she said students come for a variety of reasons. They come for comfort. They come to provide ability to study because it was just a great place to study and go. They had a great library, and they had just many places to like sit and relax. They even had like a lactation room basically where like women can actually go and like feed their babies, and which I thought was extremely interesting. But a lot of people actually go there and do that, so I thought that was really, really good. Um, for the fourth question, I said, have you noticed any changes in the community that you serve over time? And how about since the pandemic, because obviously COVID-19 has affected everybody on a day-to-day basis. And she said there has been a major shift, of course. Everything is online from like virtual events to just like meeting her in person too. But she will meet face to face if like it's necessary. And she is sweet, of course, and she's willing to do that. And they also reduced their hours. So that's been a big change for them. And so the history of the organization started at the Civil Rights Movement, and it sparked up flames across the country. Obviously, masses of Purdue students like wanted a change at Purdue. Around 200 students actually marched to the university, she said, and they demanded change and everything, and they got a lot done. Apparently, yeah, they did that on December 6th, 1970, and that was really great. And for my sixth question, I have, as an organization, what services do you provide to individuals or the community? And she said they think of themselves as a three-legged stool: the library that supports their community, and the cultural arts series, which she said they invite guest speakers to talk. And the third is performing arts, because they have a lot of basically students who practice with professional artists 6 hours a week, and they have six different ensembles, so they have a lot going on at their organization all the time. And I asked her for my seventh question, I asked her which services do they provide and they most utilize, and also the least that they most practice. And she said the performing ensemble is the most, and has 120 students that are engaged 6 hours a week through practice, and they're all evenly dispersed and used. So everything gets used. The library, everything is evenly dispersed. And I asked her how COVID-19 has impacted like their outreach in the community. And she actually said that COVID-19 has made it better because they offer virtual help in the community. She said it has grown and widely spread in, and they've seen upscale in people, and they've learned lessons such as programming and assessments. And she said another benefit has been associating with other centers and communicating with other communities at Purdue. So she has also been really good helping build relationships as well. And then for my eighth question, I said, or my ninth question, I said, what additional things would you do to help the community you serve if you had more resources? And she said that her hopes and dreams is to basically see themselves as having a place here. And she wants, the country is experiencing racial justice right now, injustice right now, and she would like to offer training and development and just training program on power and privilege, which I thought was great. She also wants to increase lectures and just the capability to study abroad. She thought that'd be great. And for my 10th and final question, I asked her, has demand for your services changed since the beginning of the pandemic, and how so? And she said that they've developed a slogan which physically distance but socially engages. So they want to maximize student potential, and it's increased the just ability to like socially engage. So those were my questions, and Renee Thomas was excellent to interview, and I enjoyed it actually a lot. It was really interesting and fun. Cassidy, how about you?
So my interview was with Sean Sharma, who is the head medical expert for the Fountain and Warren County Health Department. He's an MD, so a medical doctor. He also happens to be my primary care physician, so it didn't hurt to get an interview with him that he's my own personal doctor, which also lends itself to just showing how small my community is. That everybody's main primary care physician also happens to be the head of the health department. So for question number 1, having him describe the community that he serves, he described it by saying that Warren and Fountain County are mainly rural communities and that we have a very mixed socioeconomic group. And for question number 2, with what challenges the community faced on a day-to-day basis, he said that for medical purposes, we face the challenge of not having a lot of resources or high-tech facilities that can do everything we need. I think that just comes from the fact that we're a really small community, obviously, and most major medical things can't be done within Fountain or Warren County and have to happen actually in Lafayette quite often. We do have a hospital, but it's very small and doesn't do any like major things. So I think that is where he was coming from there. For question number 3, what are some of the reasons that your clientele seek your services? He said that the clientele come for general medical care mainly, and that he advises the county on how to best handle medical issues. And especially with COVID-19, that the medical issues had changed greatly. You know, they'd obviously gone up with COVID-19. He's had to do a lot more with the health department than he normally does. For question number 4, have you noticed any changes in the community you serve over time? How about since the beginning of the pandemic? He said the community hasn't changed much since he started. And he also said that Warren and Fountain County don't change often, and that the main problems with COVID-19 were the schools and keeping them safe. We don't have a lot of businesses really that are like, were super affected or unwilling to close or anything. Most of our small businesses are like gas stations and stuff, which of course are necessary. So they didn't close. So he wasn't really worried about that when I talked to him about the whole pandemic situation. And most of them have been cooperative, but the school, of course, is, you know, a big hotbed, and most of the action in our counties happens at the schools. I asked him to briefly describe the history of our organization and its mission, and he said the health department has been a dual effort between the counties for many years, since essentially the forming of the health department. As both are very small counties, there's no need for them to each have their own individual health department. And their mission is just to keep Warren and Fountain County as healthy as possible and follow the guidelines put down by the state and the national government, of course. For question number 6, as an organization, what services do you provide to individuals or to the community? He said that they advise the community on how to best handle medical related decisions, and other departments also check restaurants for safety and other businesses for that sort of thing. But mainly on his side, it's just how to handle large medical issues or pandemics like the coronavirus, or smaller ones like H1N1. He talked about when they had the H1N1 scare several years ago, and that was another issue that they were worried about. For the 7th question, which of the services you provide are the most utilized and the least? He said normally, outside of the pandemic, obviously the standard forms of the health department are the restaurant and business safety are the most utilized, and they don't really do things that aren't needed or utilized, because they're the health department. For question number 8, how has COVID-19 impacted your outreach to the community? He said that they've been much more active since it's such a pressing issue. Obviously, a pandemic in your community is one of the biggest concerns for a health department. For question number 9, what additional things would you do to help the community you serve if you had more resources? He said that improving the types of care you can get in this area would be great. He also said that those resources were probably not coming. but he talked about things like, more surgery options that you can have in our local hospital and things like that. And we don't have great like emergency care. Our ambulances and stuff take like 20 minutes to get to your house and that sort of thing. So he just talked about improving that sort of stuff if they had the resources. For question number 10, has demand for your services changed since the beginning of the pandemic? How so? He said the demand for the health department has certainly increased, not that it's ever really low, but that it increased. They created a special committee to handle COVID-19. They focused very heavily on the schools and the few small businesses that we have inside of our community. He said that they had to go into overdrive to get everything accomplished to keep the people as safe as possible. Then I added a few extra questions. So for my 11th question, I did, how do you think the minority groups have been affected by COVID-19? To that, he said that we've been lucky enough that we haven't had a lot of cases. Warren County is actually the least affected county for the virus, and Fountain County is also incredibly low in the state of Indiana. We've had a disproportionately high number of cases in the Latino population, but in Fountain County, but that was mainly just one specific family. Actually, just all caught the coronavirus, but since we've had such low number of cases, it made it look really high. And then for question number 12, I asked, how do you think COVID-19 has affected the African-American population in our community? And he said that there'd only been one case of an African-American having COVID-19 in Warren or Fountain County, and it was in Fountain County, and that they made a full recovery. So that was good. I'm glad that
really good.
They got proper health care in our community. For question number 13, I did, do you think the minority of population affected by COVID-19 received the proper care? He said that everyone affected by COVID in this area has received the best care that we can offer. And most of the minorities actually, and most of the people affected by COVID-19 didn't receive direct like hospital care. And that most of them have been minor enough cases that they just, stayed at home and then recovered on their own, which I think is also good because don't want to have any serious cases. And then my final question was, do you think the minority population of our community was affected more by COVID-19? And he said that in our area, majority of the cases we've seen are Caucasian. Of course, majority of the population that we've seen in our area is Caucasian. So the statistics are a little off just because of my area that I live in, but I thought it was really interesting, and obviously it led to my service learning project, so that was very cool.
Okay, so what do you feel like you learned overall?
Well, I feel like I actually learned more from my immersion activities than I did from like my interview.
I agree.
Just because like he's my primary care physician, and I'm already fairly familiar with just our county, and especially since we've had such low like COVID cases and everything, it wasn't really a lot to be learned there. But I think the immersion activities were super interesting, and I got to learn a lot of history that I had never heard before. And I think since every single resource that I used was from someone in the African American community, that it's just a great way to see somebody else's perspective on everything and just take a moment and be a little empathetic towards other people, and think about things that don't normally come up in my everyday life, of course. So I thought that was really interesting, and just learning about some of the history of the civil rights movement and how healthcare has affected African Americans nationally, and just the different ways that the civil rights movement and, you know, are all the way back to slavery have affected the socioeconomic status of African Americans, largely in the U.S. I just thought a lot of that stuff was really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like I learned like with my interview, I thought the activities were like interesting. I did like all the research, but like having the interview, it actually really like just almost like a first-hand experience to see like what they've suffered and like the changes they've had to make. So I think that was really interesting. But I definitely I didn't want to assume anything going into this project, but I did kind of have an assumption that there was a possibility that like African Americans could have less access to good proper health care. But I was hoping I was wrong, to be honest. But obviously, like that's very true, and it is like really heartbreaking to like see that. So that's like that was really sad. But
Yeah, I had sort of the assumption that, especially with my interview and that sort of data, that it wouldn't really follow the thesis since I do live in such a undiverse area. So I knew that kind of my interview was going to not necessarily support our thesis, but my outside research and my like immersion project, all of that stuff supported the thesis much more, which I think just shows that I live in an area that is very not affected by these issues. And that's not to say that majority of people aren't affected by these issues, which I definitely think they are. I just kind of knew that going in. And I was right that my community didn't necessarily or wasn't necessarily affected by issues of race, but that it, of course, is a major issue when looking at my outside research for like national and other places that are not where I'm from. It was, of course, a big issue.
yeah, that's very true. So I feel like I've definitely like learned a lot, obviously, from you, considering only like one person.
Yeah.
I guess I haven't learned like as much as I hope I would have learned, but yeah, I definitely like learned a little bit about like only one person being affected in your community, considering
Yeah.
I come from a very small community of Black culture.
Yeah, I feel like I learned a lot. I didn't know some of that history, especially from your interview. Your interview sounded really interesting, and like that was such a good person to get an interview with. So I thought that was really cool. I didn't know about that sort of service that was offered on Purdue's campus, so I thought that was really cool. That is a huge thing that I never thought of, what the civil rights movement even looked like on campus in the 1960s. So I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I think that's probably it for the presentation, unless there's anything else that you want to talk about or want to cover.
I think that's it for me.
Okay, well, have a good night. This is
Thank you. You too.
it.